Okay, well, if y'all will hang in with us for another week, we'll we're going to see how this all goes. We should probably get started for this week. And thanks to Phil for coming back another week to help run our videos. So I'm going to start with a reflection and prayer from the season of creation, Jubilee for the Earth from the National Episcopal Church. This is something that Diane just sent me this week. I thought it was appropriate. Okay, the 1854 speech attributed to Chief Seattle included these words: "Whatever befalls the earth, befalls the sons of the earth. If men spit upon the ground, they spit upon themselves. The earth is precious to God, and to harm the earth is to heap contempt on its creator. How long until we don't just know it in our heads, but know it in our hearts, and change the way we treat the creation, our neighbor? Creator, we pray that you would help us touch the earth gently. Turn us from our ways of commodifying the earth and consuming its riches without thought. Amen."
Amen.
Okay, I'm just going to recap what Diane shared last week about the fourth video that we didn't watch. Thus Saith Reality Part 1. It's just a real short paragraph. So this is what Diane said last week. "I found that Thus Saith Reality, Part 1, was what's inevitable, what's futile, and what's most urgent to be particularly gloomy. And we have probably all seen something similar that signals the devastation that will take place if we do not change course. From extreme weather, sea level rise, contamination of ocean shorelines, drought, famine, disease, war, descent of industrial civilization, salvage societies and relocation, best and worst of humanity. He shares Maslow's hierarchy of needs and our universal needs for belonging, purpose, etc. He stresses that people will need to adapt to a pre-industrial past." So that's the lead in for what we're going to be seeing. And I just wanted to take a second. I thought we should just take a moment to be thinking about the wildfires, and if we needed any other reminders of the fact that we need to pay attention to this, we have it right here in front of us today. So Phil, if you want to go ahead, this will be Thus Saith Reality Part 2.
Okay. Okay, and I'm going to hope this is the right one. I tried to load them both, but somehow only one ever shows up. So let's hope it's the right one.
It's number 5.
Yes, it is.
William Catton talks about the difference between problems that can be solved or potentially be solved and predicaments that need to be adapted to, lived with. And one of the things he talks about is the fundamental predicament of humankind is the fact that we live in a world of carrying capacity deficit, that is where we don't have enough carrying capacity to support 7.5 billion people, yet we have the mindset and expectations and institutions that reflect carrying capacity surplus. He calls it the unfathomed predicament of humankind in his book Overshoot. The discovery of the New World and the discovery of fossil fuels led Americans, and now all the nations of the world, to have carrying capacity surplus expectations and institutions. Our predicament is that we actually live in a carrying capacity deficit world. I mean, think about it from the European perspective. Europe was at saturation, meaning Europe was experiencing population pressure. too many people using too many resources and exuding too many waste, so the forests were being wiped out, the soil was washing away, and all of this conflict in Europe in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, okay? And then an entire, from the European perspective, an entire hemisphere, half a world was discovered. And because our diseases went ahead of most of us, sometimes perpetuated by giving dirty blankets and this sort of thing, but nonetheless, most Native Americans in North, Central, South America died before most Europeans had to interact with them. And so you had a situation that from the European perspective, it appeared to be an uninhabited continent, full of resources of every kind. And one of the things we know is that whenever any species is, when a new habitat opens up, a new area opens up that they didn't have access to before, that has resources that allow them to survive and thrive, their population goes skyrocketing. And there's this sense of this exuberance. It's called the age of exuberance, ecological exuberance, but also emotional exuberance. This sense that life is good, because it is. You got more than enough everything. And so liberal values tend to predominate in times of carrying capacity surplus, in times of growing economies, in times of expanding things. This liberal values predominate, and life is good because the pie is growing bigger. So everybody can get a bigger piece of the pie. So then we discovered coal, oil, and natural gas, and it turns out that North America is very, very rich in all that. So you had two things. One is the discovery of an entire hemisphere. Again, I say discovery, it was fully inhabited by the Native Americans, but it wasn't being, they were not using the land in the way that Europeans were able to. And so from the European perspective, it seemed like they were just wasting opportunities. And the Europeans lacked the kind of accountability to the future that the indigenous peoples had. Partly because the religious tradition of the West was that Jesus was coming back. I mean, every tradition, I mean, think about it. Every generation for the last 2,000 years, pretty much, in the Christian West, pretty much believed that Jesus was coming back, like, real soon. And what we can be sure is that those people die. And then their kids believe that. And those people die. And then their kids believe that. But the problem is that mindset doesn't have you be accountable to the future. It causes you to judge good and evil simply by how it impacts you and your community, your nation, your corporation, your whatever. And so the mindset that emerged here in North America, especially the United States, but the mindset that emerged here reflected carrying capacity surplus, abundance, exuberance, more than enough possibilities. And we shipped that mindset and those institutions all over the world. So the people of India and China and Bangladesh and Brazil and everywhere else, they expect to be able to eventually live like middle-class Americans. And that's what they're being sold in terms of the corporate advertising and TV and everything else. And yet we would need more than 10 planets of resources to provide that much material and to absorb that much waste. It's not going to happen. So the fundamental, the unfathomed predicament of humankind is that we live in an actual world of carrying capacity deficit, but we have carrying capacity surplus expectations, institutions, and just assumptions. And it's a predicament. It's not a problem that can be solved. We now have to adapt to it, live with it, evolve with it. So many people initially go to the place of technofix. I say this to my own embarrassment, I guess, is that up until 6 years ago, I was a techno-optimist. I had a very linear understanding of human evolution and of history. It was all about, my understanding of human history was from the caves to now to the stars. I believed we had a Star Trek future. And then what happened on December 3rd of 2012, Connie and I got climate change and the urgency of it in a major way. And we started studying this stuff. And I've spent 20 to 50 hours a week studying this stuff over the last 6 years. And I now realized that most forms of human-centered technology do more damage than good. It just happens over a longer period of time. Think of the automobile. One automobile, no problem. 10 billion automobiles? Big problem. That's why I'm not anti-technology. I'm all for pro-future technology. pro-nature technology. Technology and artificial intelligence that helps us live in a mutually enhancing relationship with the living world. But we have to be humble enough to mimic. It's sometimes called biomimicry, where we mimic the wisdom of the living world. So technofix, why technology won't save us or the environment, practically scripture in terms of understanding why techno-idolatry is actually harmful. And I say techno-idolatry. Technofix shows that negative unintended consequences of technology are inherently predictable and unavoidable, that techno-optimism is unjustified, and that modern technology in the presence of continued economic growth, that's key, does not promote sustainability but hastens collapse. The authors convincingly demonstrate that most technological solutions to social and technology-created problems are counterproductive. They explore the reasons for the uncritical acceptance of new technologies, show who really controls the direction of technological change, and then advocate extensive reform. And there was a major conference a few years ago in New York City on this whole topic of techno-utopianism and the fate of the earth. And this is like a who's who of major contributors, authors and teachers and scholars and activists in this whole field of deep sustainability. So coming back here to this realizing, untrivializing and unrelativizing good and evil, that nothing is more important than accountability to the future, intergenerational justice. And I want to give a quote, but I need to set the context. I read this book 2 years ago and was so blown out of the water by this book that I called John Michael Greer, the author, up. I called the publisher up and I said, I will volunteer. I don't want any money. I will volunteer to go into a recording studio and record the official audiobook of this book because it's just so great. It has to be available in audio. And at the end of the chapter of the ecological aftermath is probably the best paragraph that I've ever read in terms of what accountability to the future really means. I sometimes wonder what our descendants in the deindustrial world will think about the bitter legacy that we're leaving them. As they reflect back on the people of the 20th and early 21st centuries who gave them the barren soil and ravaged fisheries, the chaotic weather and rising oceans, the poisoned land and water, the birth defects and cancers that embitter their lives, how will they remember us? I think I know. I think we will be the orcs and Nazgul of their legends, the collective Satan of their mythology, the ancient race who ravaged the earth and everything on it so that they could enjoy lives of wretched excess at the future's expense. They will remember us as evil incarnate, and from their perspective, it's by no means easy to dispute that judgment. This is not the final word, however, because there will also be people that are revered, not reviled. And it will be those of us who take on as a primary religious responsibility to help our species repent from its human-centeredness and to once again be accountable to the future. That, I suggest, is what the second coming of Christ is all about. Ecological overshoot, it turns out, is always a religious failure. Idolatry, anthropocentrism, human-centeredness inevitably leads to ecological overshoot, followed by societal simplification, a collapse of complexity, and population reduction. And the interesting thing is, there are no counterexamples. We don't know of a single counterexample to this in human history. Here's this long descent, the catabolic collapse. What happens is societies contract because they first overextend what they can afford to maintain, and then they can't afford to maintain it anymore, and so they start eating themselves. That's what the Rust Belt is. The Rust Belt is catabolic collapse. And one of the reasons why President Trump won't be able to make America great again is that we don't have the dense, concentrated energy that we had in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The collapse of complex societies, Joseph Tainter. They see the Seneca Cliff, this idea of the path to increase is slow, but the road to ruin is swift. That's why I say civilizations typically take half the time to collapse as it took them to become great. So, what can we say is futile? We don't want to invest time and energy in what's futile. We want to be able to accept what's inevitable and then be in action, dealing with whatever grief we have to deal with. I suggest to you that these things are futile. Hoping for perpetual progress, imminent apocalypse, or if we all just... Turns out that what we've learned in collapsing other civilizations and Tracting civilizations, these are the three most common places that most people go to, which is, there's no problem here, it's still getting better. That's perpetual progress. Or if they let go of that, there's nothing we can do, the whole thing's going to hell. Imminent apocalypse. And if those two options aren't gained, most of us that have a heart for the future, you know, if we all just believed this way or did this, if we all became vegans, if we all rode bicycles, if we all, whatever it may be, it turns out that those are the three least likely things that happen. Everybody never gathers, at least we don't have any evidence yet in human history, everybody ever doesn't all come to some insight. It never is the end of the world, but nor is it ever perpetual progress. So, what's also futile is expecting your loved ones to not hope or believe in one of these three delusions. So we can have compassion for ourselves and others. Assuming that technology or the market can sustain what is unsustainable. Faith in the techno-narcissistic religion of everlasting growth on a finite planet. Expecting your instincts to not at least occasionally challenge you or others. Denying that mortality and death are real and necessary, individually and as a species. There may be nothing more empowering than coming to embrace in a spiritually nourishing way the reality of mortality and death. Expecting religion or society to repent of human-centeredness prior to collapse. Not going to happen. As much as I'd love it to happen. Expecting industrial civilization and global capitalism to run on renewable energy. Let's just say it may be possible to run a civilization on renewable energy. I mean, renewable energy is absolutely our future. It's the only future we have, right? But we can't run this kind of civilization on renewable energy. There may be forms of ecological civilization. China is actually already committed to transforming, and they realize it's going to take a long time, but the concept, the meme, the idea of ecological civilization is now central to China's vision of the future. They know that that's the only future that they or any other nation can possibly have. And mistaking the end of the world as we know it for the end of the world full stop. It's not the end of the world full stop, but it is the end of the world as most of us who grew up in the 20th century have known it. Sanity is when your thinking is aligned with reality, and insanity is when your thinking is not aligned with reality. And these are not just personal or individual things, they're collective things. Here's a picture that I think illustrates collective insanity. They're playing golf while the entire mountainside is in flames. This was taken in Oregon last summer. I love this quote from Robert Louis Stevenson. Sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. See, that's the great reckoning. The great reckoning is unavoidable. And it's not because some supernatural being outside the universe is pissed off at us and punishing us. It's because there's consequences when you're out of right relationship to reality. However, I believe this can also be the great homecoming. Humanity, the prodigal species. Yes, we squandered our inheritance, but thankfully, we're waking up to our predicament, in the pig pen as it were, and coming home to God, to reality. What's urgent collectively? To protect and restore the integrity and the well-being of our larger body, the biosphere, by becoming less colossal, individually and collectively, with all deliberate speed. Nothing is more important than scaling down, not just individually, but collectively. Renouncing false gods, technology, the market, the secular religion of human-centered progress and development, the delusion of infinite growth on a finite planet. We need to reject these false gods. Passionately promoting pro-future and condemning anti-future programs, policies, institutions, and human-centered measures of success and well-being. What's also urgent is prioritizing intergenerational justice and massive nonviolent civil disobedience and climate direct action. Calling religious leaders to repent of non-accountability to the future and insisting on God first, seventh generation, sacred limits, and consequence capture. And expanding our circle of compassion to include future generations and other species. Again, it's the shift from human-centeredness to life-centeredness. This is one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein. A human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a sort of optical delusion of our consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty, now and well into the future. I suggest that those of us alive today that are especially deserving of compassion and generosity, poor people, communities, and nations who will suffer the most from climate and ecological breakdowns, yet who contributed the least to its main causes. Those of us feeling the loneliness of having to navigate our own downshifting expectations whilst family, friends, and maybe even spouses are in denial. Individuals, couples, children, families, and communities of our fellow social and mammalian species who generally feel and suffer just like we do. Techno-optimists and free market fundamentalists who will remain in denial the longest and be hardest hit emotionally and financially when reality bites. Religious, political, and social liberals and progressives whose faith in the religion of perpetual progress is currently being shaken, shattered, or abandoned. And also deserving of compassion and generosity, religious conservatives whose faith in the Bible has blinded them to what God or reality has revealed evidentially about our nature, our world, and our times, and who thus struggle disproportionately with addiction, teen pregnancy, domestic violence, depression, suicide, and sin in general. See, it's so easy to be judgmental, and yet I do believe this is the century of humility, grief, and compassion.
Okay, there was a lot to take in there. I have some specific questions, but I wonder if you would just like to not really brainstorm, but just shout out what you take away from that. Is it something that really struck you, that really hit you?
Well, I was struck by this technological idea.
Just lost your sound.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you were coming and going. Go ahead.
So back in the 1930s and 40s, you know, the Inklings with Lewis and Tolkien got together and they thought the world was too much focus on technology. So that's what kind of generated the Lord of the Rings and, you know, Treebeard and his associates essentially being a critical part of the war effort, not high technology. And I'm just struck that that's, you know, we become enamored with bright, shiny things in technology. I mean, it's certainly true in my field in science. You know, the grants that are tending to get funded are, you know, the more technology, the better. You know, and if you've got, and yet I'm struck that, like, my sister is in architecture and she said there was a push to make things more technologically savvy, but now they're returning to, you know, just outdoor light and spaciousness. And I think that the COVID pandemic is sort of forcing us into that position. I know, at least again in my field, if it's, you know, doing an MRI scan is not really feasible right now. So if we're trying to move from the hospital to the clinic to the home, you know, interventions that you can use at home. And I think this idea that you just wear a mask, like they do in Taiwan, can reduce the incidence of COVID pandemic, just as it did back in the the 17 epidemic, the 1918 flu epidemic. So this, I think one of the things we do have to lose is this idolatry on technology. And it's sort of like the Druids returning in Britain to their focus on nature, the Native Americans, you know, in face of the Roman Empire initially, or in America, the European invasion. So I think this return to simplicity in nature is, and I think it's worthwhile to shame people who don't. I mean, I think, and make that a value system.
Okay, thank you, Barbara.
Hello, this is Gary.
Okay, Gary, hi.
Hi, I want to share the type. I was late arriving to this forum, but so you may have discussed it already. But I have read Michael Dowd's book called "Thank God for Evolution." It is a seminal work, and I highly recommend it. "Thank God for Evolution" by Michael Dowd. It's about, I think he wrote it in 2014. And it's life-changing, and it has all sorts of encomiums. People are just raving about it, and it's changing congregation spiritual approaches to ecology. And I just highly recommend "Thank God for Evolution" by Michael Dowd.
Great, thank you, Gary. Thanks. Okay. Anyone else?
I was struck, and Jeff, you can probably say more about this than I can, but his talk made me think about the difference between abundance and enough.
Mm-hmm.
Something that we're just starting to talk about in terms of stewardship, that we've been pushing this idea for a good while now, trying to get away from a theology of scarcity and fear to a theology of abundance, that there is plenty, that God wants us to have everything. But perhaps we need to tweak that more than a little bit and pull back to God wants us to have enough and wants everybody to have enough. And maybe that doesn't mean everybody gets abundance. And that to me there's an underlying theology there to explore.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Well, there's also an opportunity for people who have a lot to share, which is another of our values. And how to, I don't know that shaming is the best way. I get the impression that shaming will feel more entrenched in their behavior. But I think that idea, as the leaders of faith communities, can instill that idea along with some other information. That could be a real benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I really like that idea of, Carolyn's trying to move us along.
Go ahead.
Really quick point. Piggybacking on that abundance versus enough thing, I've really been thinking a lot about what he's been talking about in terms of seeing the world as a machine, which he didn't talk a lot about today, but he has in some of the past talks, and how humanity started seeing the world as a machine in the Newtonian era, and I think that furthered us as that sort of abundance, that the earth is something I can take as much as I want to from, as opposed to enough. And how do I see the earth and creation as something where it's a living, the earth and the ecosystem is something that is organic in and of itself, not a machine from which I take from. Mm-hmm. So how enough is not something that is only about humanity, but enough is something about all of creation. How do we have enough for all of creation, not just for that the human-centeredness that he's talking about, and how enough is how we have enough not just for humanity, but for the whole living organism of creation. Mm-hmm. That's not just about humanity. That's what he's making me think about a little bit. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I found it a little disheartening that at one point he said that he don't expect your relatives to change their ideas until things start collapsing.
Have you experienced that in your family?
I have, but more in a political sense. There are some, this is climate change, all of that data was wrong from that little glitch they had with a scientist a couple of years ago. But it's very hard to reason. I don't think you can reason your way out of some of this. Yeah. So one of the things phrases we use in our family, is one of my sisters said, is you may not believe in climate change, but the insurance companies do.
Yeah. What you're saying is making me think about the ending of the video we saw last week, if you were here, with Catherine Hayhoe, talking with people about this, talking about our shared values, which is a different approach from shaming or even just look at this, don't you see it kind of thing, but coming at it from our personal heart, from our heart. Okay, I think we probably need to go to the next video. We can come back to any of this if there's time afterwards, but we'll have other stuff to talk about. Phil. Phil.
So I want to speak about the human predicament, our inescapable, mismatched instincts, why we are the way that we are, why we struggle, why we suffer, why we get addicted, why our kids and grandkids have struggles. I did my first TEDx talk in 2012 in Grand Rapids on this topic, why we struggle now. And I had 3 evangelicals at the end of my program that evening in the social come up to me, and all 3 of them said basically the same thing. Because, as you know, Grand Rapids, or as I suspect you know, Grand Rapids, Michigan is a pretty conservative part of the world. And these 3 evangelicals independently all said basically the same thing, which was, I was a young earth creationist until I heard your talk. Now I've got to accept evolution. I've just got to do it in a God-honoring way. One young man, he was probably in his mid-20s, he said, I always thought that evolution was about Darwin DNA and dinosaurs. I didn't know it was about how to have a more healthy relationships and a more Christ-like life. The practical side of evolution. These are 2 great quotes from 2 of the major intellectual heavyweights of the last 50 years, Gregory Bateson and Edward O. Wilson. The major problems in the world are the result of the difference between the way nature works and the way men think. Now, for many years, I used this quote and I changed men to people. But then I thought about it a little more differently, a little more deeply. And I think the problem is probably more on my half of the species side, the male side. So I went back to the quote as he originally wrote it. To Edward O. Wilson, we exist in a bizarre combination of Stone Age emotions, medieval beliefs, and godlike technology. I mentioned David Sloan Wilson earlier as one of the major people, scholars. He's probably the leading evolutionary theorist in the world. The top 3 evolutionary theorists are generally recognized as David Sloan Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, and Richard Dawkins. And David Sloan Wilson and Edward Wilson are both really big on what's also called group selection, where selection doesn't just happen individually. But this quote from David really helps set the stage for evolutionary psychology. Our unique human attributes evolved over a period of roughly 6 million years. They represent modifications of great ape attributes that are roughly 10 million years old, and mammalian attributes that are roughly 245 million years old. We also harbor vertebrate attributes that are roughly 600 million years old, and attributes of nucleated cells that are perhaps 1.5 billion years old. If you think it's unnecessary to go that far back in the tree of life to understand our own attributes, consider the humbling fact that we share with nematode worms the same gene that controls appetite. At most, our unique attributes are like an addition to a vast multi-room mansion. It is sheer hubris to think that we can ignore all but the newest rooms. Why we struggle and suffer in self-destruct? Well, the first is that denial, it turns out, is pretty deeply rooted, especially when we start seeing agricultural societies. Once we left the garden, to speak mythically, once we thought it was all about us as humans and started having human-centered agriculture and human-centered everything, denial became so problematic. Denial is the largely unconscious mechanism whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview, how we live, what is required of us, and or our feelings of superiority. I've heard of denial, I just don't believe in it. Stephen Jenkinson is this amazing death worker. I love this quote. Inattention to the world's ecological state is well advised, because attention to it mitigates against your happiness, contentment, and your sense of well-being. Having a conscience now is a grief-soaked proposition. If you awaken in our time, you awaken with a sob. Is that powerful? So that's why we can have compassion for those in denial, not just self-righteous judgment. And this is an 1 hour and 10-minute long documentary on Stephen Jenkinson's work called Grief Walker. It's an award-winning Canadian documentary. Connie and I have shared it with dozens of people. And then his book, Die Wise, is absolutely fabulous. I only discovered Paul Czafurka maybe 6 months ago, maybe 5 months ago. And I couldn't believe how prescient, how powerful, how prophetic, and how heartful. He actually now goes by Bodhi Paul Czafurka. And he wrote tons of stuff on his blog, which is Approaching the Limits to Growth. You can access it through paulchafurka.ca. He's Canadian. He wrote a lot from 2008 to 2013, and then he gave up writing in November 2013 because he realized he wasn't going to make that big of a difference. He wasn't going to be able to convert enough people. He wasn't going to be able to forestall the kinds of things I talked about were inevitable. And now he's pursuing a spiritual path, both inward and outward. And here he talks about climbing the ladder of awareness, 5 stages in awakening. And I wanted to share this. These are his words, because it just was so powerful when I experienced this. So the first is dead asleep, just pure denial. Awareness of one fundamental problem, awareness of many problems, awareness of the interconnections between the many problems, and awareness that the predicament encompasses all aspects of life. Dead asleep is basically this stance. Problems, problems, what problems? The only problem is what we're focusing on and telling ourselves. It's all still mostly good and getting better. Just look at technology. You can't stop progress. At this stage, this is Paul Czafurka's language. At this stage, there seem to be no fundamental problems, just shortcomings in human organization, behavior, and morality that can be fixed with the proper attention to rulemaking. People at this stage tend to live their lives happily, with occasional outbursts of annoyance around election times or the quarterly corporate earnings seasons. Awareness of one fundamental problem. Whether it's climate change, soil loss, overpopulation, peak oil, chemical pollution, oceanic overfishing, biodiversity collapse, corporatism, economic instability, or socio-political injustice, one problem seems to engage the attention completely. People at this stage tend to become ardent activists for their cause. They tend to be quite vocal about their particular issue, yet remain relatively blind to any others. Awareness of many problems. As people let in more evidence from different domains, the awareness of complexity begins to grow. At this point, a person worries about the prioritization of problems in terms of immediacy and degree of impact. People at this stage may become reluctant to acknowledge new problems. For example, someone who is committed to fighting for social justice and against climate change may not recognize the problem of resource depletion. They may feel that the problem space is already too complex, and the addition of any new concerns will only dilute the effort that needs to be focused on solving the highest priority problem. Awareness of the interconnections between the many problems. The realization that a solution in one domain may worsen a problem in another marks the beginning of large-scale system-level thinking. It also marks the transition from thinking of the situation in terms of a set of problems to thinking of it in terms of a predicament. At this point, the possibility that there may not be a solution begins to raise its head. People who arrive at this stage tend to withdraw into tight circles of like-minded people in order to trade insights and deepen their understanding of what's going on. These circles are necessarily small, both because personal dialogue is essential for this depth of exploration and because there just aren't very many people who have arrived at this level of understanding. Awareness that the predicament encompasses all aspects of life. This includes everything we do, how we do it, all our relations, and our treatment of the biosphere and the planet. With this realization, the floodgates open and no problem is exempt from consideration or acceptance. The very concept of a solution, capital S, is seen through and cast aside as a waste of effort. For those who arrive at stage 5, there is a real risk that depression will set in. After all, we've learned throughout our lives that our hope for tomorrow lies in our ability to solve problems today. When no amount of human cleverness appears able to solve our predicament, the possibility of hope can vanish like the light of a candle flame, to replaced by the suffocating darkness of despair. A new story, this is my words, a new story or interpretation and an inner or outer spiritual path is necessary. That's why I so appreciate Bill's emphasis on daily spiritual practice. And I went through this identically. I was dead asleep from 2000 to 2012. December of 2012, I woke up to climate change. 2013, through my studies, I realized, we got lots of problems. 2014, I realized, there's some serious interconnections between these problems. And January of 2015, I read William Catton's book, Overshoot, which I consider the most important book of the 20th century, the most important book I've ever read. And that's when I got the predicament. So, all that was sort of to let you know that denial makes sense, and we can have compassion for ourselves and our loved ones who may still be in one or another form of denial. Mismatched instincts and supernormal stimuli. This is a little less heavy. Some of this is really fun. Our instincts did not evolve to help us live in the kind of world we now live in. Our instincts evolved over millions of years to help us survive and thrive in the kind of world that all animals lived in and that humans lived in until about 10,000 years ago. And every year, every decade, in the last 10,000 years, our instincts have been more and more mismatched to the actual conditions we live in. So that now, our instincts cause us a lot of problems. I mean, you would not expect a wolf or a bear or an elephant to go counter to their instincts very easily, right? And yet we have to go counter to our instincts every day, many times a day. Otherwise, we cause all kinds of problems for ourselves, our marriages, our lives. So understanding this can help us understand some of the things that we find challenging and problematic about ourselves and each other. Now, the concept of supernormal allurements. There was a book written about 5 years ago by Deirdre Barrett called Supernormal Stimuli: How Primal Urges Overran Their Evolutionary Purpose. Because here's the thing. This is not food. This is a concentration of food-like items that we are evolutionarily programmed to want and to want more of. You will never find anything like this in the living world. Almost everyone will overeat if dining on supernormal stimuli. They've taken birds' eggs, and if you replace the normal egg, in many different species, if you replace the normal egg with a ceramic egg or a wooden egg that's a little bigger, a little brighter, a little more pronounced, right? The bird will always sit on the fake egg. Its own eggs will die, and it always sits on the fake egg. It's supernormal stimuli. Bees will become addicted to cocaine. Roundworms will become addicted to nicotine. I love this quote from Deirdre Barrett. She says, "The most dangerous aspect of our modern diet arises from our ability to refine food. This is the link to drug, alcohol, and tobacco addictions. Coca doesn't give South American Indians health problems when they brew or chew it. No one's ruined his life eating poppy seeds. When grapes and grains were fermented lightly and occasionally, they presented a healthy pleasure, not a hazard. Salt, fat, sugar, and starch are not harmful in their natural contexts. It's our modern ability to concentrate things like cocaine, heroin, alcohol, and food components that turns them into a menace that our bodies are hardwired to crave." The good news is that this can help us to honor what's real. For example, we all have cravings for sugar, salts, and fats. Why is that? Well, it's because for 99% of human history, it wasn't easy to find sugar, salts, and fats. So having a craving for those things allowed our ancestors to survive long enough to reproduce. Yet today, we are bombarded with foods that have sugar, salts, and fats. Yet we still have the cravings as if they were rare. There's a mismatch. Every one of us in this room, I can say with 100% certainty, every one of us in this room is alive today because some of your ancestors were really, really good at storing energy as fat and holding on to that fat as long as possible. Because that's how we survived the droughts, the harsh winters, the lean times. And guess what? Our ancestors were so good, they passed those genes on to us. So we have those instincts. We have those genes, many of us. And so it's a mismatch. Especially postmenopausal women, especially find it easy to gain weight, to store energy, and to hold on to that for good evolutionary reasons. Testosterone, one of the things we know that's true in all men and all women is that the higher the testosterone, the more they think about sex. In fact, Connie and I stayed at the home of a scientist, a woman who shared with us vulnerably that her doctor had put her on hormonal patches. And she said after 3 days, she said, I couldn't stop thinking about sex. She said, is this what guys have to deal with? Well, the answer is yes, actually. Turns out that men have 10 to 20 times the testosterone that women have. Now, this is a rock formation, okay? Right? I mean, think about it. What was there to be addicted to 10,000 years ago? Were we going to run into some fermented berries? Right? Hard liquor was only invented like 350 years ago. And now, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, video games, shopping, internet porn, romance novels, social networking, all of this stuff, it's so easy and almost effortless to become distracted at least, or sometimes addicted. Cover of Newsweek about 5 years ago. iCrazy, panic, depression, psychosis, how connectivity addiction is rewiring our brains. I want to share the parable of the pickle jar. Halsey Barlow is my wife's niece. Now, she's 33 years old now, but she sent us this email when she was 18. She grew up in a very conservative context, conservative Catholic context, and it was only Connie introducing her to evolution later on. And so she started reading books like this one by Robert Wright, The Moral Animal, Why We Are the Way We Are, The New Science of Evolutionary Psychology. She still considers it one of the most important books she's ever read. And she sent us this email. It's priceless. She said, I now put everything into an evolutionary context. It's almost become a reaction that when I encounter a situation, I think, okay, why am I feeling this way? How and why would 780th great-grandmother react to this? It doesn't even have to be anything significant. For instance, if I see one of my roommates snacking on my jar of pickles, I get this feeling in my stomach like, hey, back off, those are mine, mine, mine. I want to be laid back and not care, but my instincts are so darn uptight. But knowing that I'm a selfish, status-seeking hornball only motivates me to do things that say, F you to my evolutionary roots, even though I really do love them. I absolutely love how imperfect and clumsy we are as humans. I mean, almost any situation can be laughed off if we only step back and take a look at why we feel the way that we do. I love it. I wouldn't want it any other way. This is 18 years old to have this insight. How this can help untrivialize or realize mythic wisdom. Before microscopes, it wasn't just difficult to understand infection, it was impossible to understand infection before we could even see bacteria. Prior to telescopes, it wasn't just difficult to understand the large-scale structure of the universe, it was utterly impossible. Well, prior to an understanding of our brain, an evolutionary understanding of our brain, it wasn't just difficult to understand human instincts, it was effectively impossible. And yet, there were deep intuitions. For example, the Apostle Paul said it pretty profoundly. I'm a slave to sin. I really don't understand myself. I have the desire to do what is good, but I don't do it. What I end up doing is not the good I want to do, but what I hate to do. What a wretched man am I. I believe that history will show that one of the greatest psychological and spiritual revelations or realizations of the 20th century was the discovery that human beings have powerful, indeed compelling instincts, just like all other animals do. And that if we don't humble ourselves before primary reality, the living God, prioritize the future, and respect, that is, honor and harness our inherited drives, we are bound to be enslaved to them. Some of the emotional and practical benefits of a sacred science, evolutionary understanding of our nature is that we can have gratitude for what we've inherited. Once you realize the evolutionary significance of being able to gain weight and hold on to it, you don't have to judge yourself and feel frustrated, which paradoxically makes it easier to actually lose weight. We keep our patterns stuck by judging ourselves. We can move beyond denial, guilt, and resentment. We can have compassion for ourselves and others. There was a neurobiologist that talked to us who said that the more she learns about the brain, she said, the more compassion that I have for myself and others. She said, isn't it amazing that science is giving us access to this traditional spiritual virtue? Healing broken relationships becomes much easier and much more rapid when you understand, of course, what's going on. And developing a witness capacity, not just the witness like sitting on a cushion, meditating witness, but an evolutionary witness that allows us to step outside and see ourselves and see each other from a more compassionate, understanding place.
Thank you, Bill. Is everybody back? Okay. One of the predicament, one of the ways I saw the predicament was the reality without despair. How do we encompass, agree with, accept this reality without falling into despair? And then the question would be, where do we find hope? Or you can just respond with something that struck you.
Well, for me, one of the best books on evolution is that by Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, who's a Christian, The Language of God, and he talks about how through DNA, but he also makes a distinction that our moral values are distinct from the evolutionary process. Mm-hmm. And the other point I just wanted to make, I remember hearing Brian McLaren talking at St. Paul's Cathedral many years ago about how to change human behavior, and whether it's civil rights or LGBTQ, you need a leader, and then you need someone, a movement, and those come together. I think like young people, it's cool to wear a mask, or it's cool to take care of the environment. Then that gives hope for changing behavior.
Good, thank you. I've read that book by Francis Collins. It's good.
Yeah.
The Language of God. Yeah. Okay.
I wonder if we can use the grieving process as a model for navigating through this, because denial, of course, is one of the aspects of grieving, and so is depression or despair. And I wonder if there's a way to use what we know about the grieving process to help us move through this, to get to a place of the new normal, and coping and new life and resurrection.
Joanna Macy Rogers, who is a Buddhist, many years ago, 30 or 40 years ago, started giving grief workshops that concerned, it was the nuclear issue primarily then, but also the environment. And I used those materials in my classes, and it was, I think this Michael Dowd, he's just awakened to these things himself, and he assumes that the rest of us are either in denial or asleep, and that's not true. There have been movements going on for decades and decades concerning these issues.
Right. We still have a long way to go, though.
And one thing that strikes me that he hasn't said, as far as I've seen anything about, is that I believe deeply that if we actually follow Jesus, the way Jesus told us to live, which was to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves, and make that our total priority, that we would live a sustainable lifestyle. and that we would live one of joy and hope and peace. I think he undersells the sort of resources that are in the Christian tradition and probably the other religious traditions too, or at least up to this point, it seems to me he does. And instead kind of tends to lump all of those more, that kind of the great ages of world religions as they develop into this imperialistic kind of framework. And I think it's, well, as Calvin sort of pointed out the very first time, it just seems to me a very simplistic reading of history. History is much more complex. So anyway, I think there's enormous resources in Christianity there that we have not tapped, or have tapped in part. St. Francis and other saints have tapped them. But
Bill, this is Gary. What you've shown on these podcasts, on these short film strips, misses the fact that he is a Christian pastor. And the message that's missing this morning is the Christian response to our evolutionary past and the place that Jesus, the Christ, plays in our understanding about what happened with us. And that's missing this morning. And he has much more to say about that. And I refer back to the book that I just recommended. The last half of his book is all about the Christian response to everything he said this morning, and we don't have it here this morning.
Mm-hmm. Right.
thank you, Gary.
And we do have two more videos to come next week.
Well, thank you.
One of the things I'm also thinking is that unfortunately, where am I with this? I was going to speak and then I lost my train of thought. There it goes. Choo-choo. Okay, Gary, maybe I'll remember it.
Welcome to the old age.
Well, I've been here for a while.
I think for me, some of the hope, this is where I think that I'm not a huge fan of Michael Dowd, but I appreciate what he's trying to do. And I appreciate the conversation that the videos generate in our community. So I'm glad that we're watching him. But I think one of the places where I diverge from him theologically is that I do believe in a transcendent God. And one of the reasons that I think that's important for me, that I think is different for him, is that I think the hope piece for me comes because I think we are called to do all that we can. And for all the reasons he listed in that last video about here's all the things we can't expect, like we can't expect the world to change, people are still not going to do the right thing. You know, our ability to change this is going to be limited because we are not God. And so for me, ultimately, the hope has to be in God in some way. And I don't think that's where he's going because for him, God is the universe. And so I think that's where I have a little bit of a difference with him. That doesn't stop me from wanting to believe that the church needs to do all that we can and prioritize creation care and stewardship in a much different way, perhaps, than we have in the past.
Now, I remember what I was going to say and apologize. I was listening to what you said too. I think part of it's connecting the dots. There are a lot of Christians in our world. And if we were all doing what, Jesus told us, Jesus brought to us as a way of life, we wouldn't have these issues, I don't think. So I think the importance of getting information from people, and he's one of the people we can get this information from. I've learned an awful lot so far. I'm not excited about some of his theology or how he comes across. So I think the information is important. And the reminders maybe are part of that information. We know these things, but we need to be reminded because our world is in a dire state. And maybe we just need to connect our dots and we need to work together and soon.
Okay, thank you. It is 10, so if anybody needs to go, obviously, Was there another voice there though?
Oh, that was just me. I can wait till people leave and then I can vent.
You don't have to. I can tell this is going to be a really positive comment, Calvin. Okay. I have just a, and I thought I did have something. Maybe I don't. Okay, this is another prayer. Lord, your word gave us this marvelous creation. Forgive us for what we have done to it and for what we have not done to protect it. Empower our recreative work to restore the joy, the exuberance, and the promise of your abundance. Amen.